Awesome. All right. So we are now recording. Thank you everyone for arriving on time, and thank you everyone for showing up for the 9th week of conversations on racial equity. Before I pull up the slides, I'd like to acknowledge that I am calling you from the land of the Palawa, Pakana people here in Luchawita, and I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past, present, and future, and to pay my respects to all First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander who are live here tonight with us, as well as those who will be watching the recording potentially in the future. Thank you for being here tonight. As I mentioned, getting to the pointy end of the conversation. We're building on the foundational learnings we've developed. Can you believe it's been 8 weeks so far and we are into week 9 already? It's flown by really quickly. And I'm really grateful for all of you who show up week after week. Tonight's conversation is about climate change. And I know we've got lots of opinions about how climate change impacts different people differently. And oftentimes it impacts the lives of those who have least to do with it the most. But that's not what I want to focus our attention on tonight. We're going to go a bit deeper. We're going to get down to the deep end of the pool, and we're going to move beyond the prevalent common discourse of how climate change impacts people differently. And we're going to actually talk about how racism was literally led to is the cause of climate change. That might be a bit of a leap for some people, and it might actually be common knowledge for some others, which I find really fascinating. So I've created a poll just on that, in fact, just to get the ball rolling. I'm going to pull it up now and ask you to participate in this poll, because it is interesting to me how for some of us, those of us who work in anti-racism spaces or decolonization or D&I space in the corporate world, this idea of how racism led to climate change isn't too far-fetched, and some of us have some idea of it, some grasp of it, and for others it's a completely new idea. So I've created a poll here that I'm going to launch. I'd love to hear, hey, Anthony, good to see you. Anthony Houston, Marcella, thank you for sharing. The poll's now live, and the question is, did racism cause climate change? And there are, I think, 3 options there. And the choices are, I know how racism caused climate change well enough to explain it to others. The second option is, I have some idea, but not enough to explain it. And the other one is, I do not know how racism caused climate change. Just to give us a sense of who's here. Obviously, the group here is a pretty well-versed group of people. A lot of you work in these sorts of spaces. So I'm expecting a significant number will know already well enough to explain it. But also some people coming from the climate space, from the climate action space, from the environmentalism space, who might be new to this idea as well. So this is great. I'm watching your results come in. You're always really fast with the poll, so appreciate that. Thank you. And I'm hoping even those of you who have selected the first option, which is you know enough about it to explain it, I'm hoping that I can impart some knowledge to you as well to help in the work that you're doing. We're almost there. We've had 86% of you respond, so there's only a few who haven't. I might end that now unless someone's just about to contribute. That's about it. Thank you. All right, I'll end the poll and I will share that result with you now. So we've got a pretty good mix. The results show that 31% of you know enough about it to explain it to others, so 1/3. About half said you have some idea how it's connected, but not enough to explain it, which is common. And about 1/4 of you, 25% of you, or 23% said you don't know how climate change racism led to climate change, and you'd like to learn. This is great. So hopefully I can leave you all with some new findings, some new learnings tonight to help us all explain how this is interconnected. Thank you, Michael, for sharing what you're doing. Thank you, Renee, for sharing what you're doing. I did ask for some of you earlier to tell us what areas you're working in. And I do save the chat at the end of each session, and I do read the comments. So if I ever don't respond to something you've typed up, it's because I'm not able to see everything, but I will be reading these later as well. So thank you for that. All right, good to know where we're at as a group. I'm going to stop sharing that poll result and get straight into the presentation now. Got a few other polls coming up tonight for us as well. As I acknowledged, we are all, wherever we are on this continent of Australia, we are on the lands of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And it's important to remember that, not just as an acknowledgement, but as a foundational principle in the work that we're doing in anti-racism, in climate action, in gender equality or economic justice. this recognition of whose country you're on needs to be foundational to that, because if it's not, then the work we're doing can oftentimes do more harm than we intend. The map of Australia, this map of this great continent of 500 various nations with their own unique and distinct cultures and languages is going to come up again later on. So I won't dwell on it right now, but you will see this again, and we will talk about how these great nations did coexist side by side for so long. For those of you who have never heard this idea that colonialism and climate change are connected, yes, it is true. It was in the most recent IPCC report, the 6th one, and there are plenty of articles that highlight some of the key points of that report. And this is one of them. The link is there. I'm not sure if it's, obviously you're not going to be able to click on it because you're just viewing it on a screen. But if you Google these words, you will be able to come up with it. Anyone who needs the link, I can actually copy the link and share it in the post. So here you go. Anyone who'd like to see this one, I'll try and keep up with all of the links for you. So yeah, it did cause climate change. Tonight, we're going to unpack how and why and what we need to do about that in the hour and 15 minutes that we have. So we're again trying to fit in a whole lot in a very short period of time. So we've done the poll. We know where we're at as a group. Now, let's see how you are at as far as your knowledge retention. Those of you who have been here from, say, week 1, or those of you who've been watching the recordings regularly, what was the heartbeat of racism as we discussed in session 1 and 2? There was a quote from a well-known author that I used that described what the heartbeat of racism is. Thank you, Miley. Yes. Your answer has just gone to hosts and panelists. So you might want to change your message settings so it goes to everyone. Some of you sometimes message us directly and the rest of the group can't see it. Thanks heaps. Yes. So if you want to just repeat that, because I don't think everyone else has seen that just yet. The heartbeat of racism, the thing that keeps racism alive is close. We'll get there, Nidhi. We're going to get to that very shortly. Miley, if you wanted to just repeat it, colonialism, we'll get to that in a minute. The heartbeat of it, what keeps racism alive in our society, is neither power nor colonialism. It's fear. It's not fear, but yeah, fear's got a lot to do with it. It's denial. Thank you, Miley. It is, in fact, denial. The fact that we can't come to terms with the fact that it exists. Our denial of the fact that racism exists is what keeps it alive. So wherever we are in progressive spaces, well-meaning spaces, around the family dinner table, socializing with friends, the fact that we deny racism exists, so we can't really quite come to terms with the fact that it exists, is what keeps it alive. When we actually shed a light on it, when we begin talking about it, it's much easier to address it and dismantle racism in society. So what kept it alive is denial. And the essence of racism, which is what I think one of you shared in the comments earlier, well, if we boil it down and get down to the essence of what racism has always been about, then we get to, one of you's already answered it. So which one of you was it? Thank you, Jane. Power. Thank you, Katrine. It's power, right? Supremacy and power. So it's what keeps it alive is denial, and what it is truly at its essence is about power dynamics and oppression, marginalization, exclusion. All of these things, discrimination, all require power, right? So there we are. Quick revision from the very beginning of our series. And those of you who think I'm not wearing a t-shirt with a message tonight, don't. Not so quick. It's just hidden under the breast of my jacket. So what do we mean by the essence of racism is power? Let's now land this. For those who haven't been watching regularly, who haven't tuned in or watched the recordings, what do we mean? For those of you who have been here week in, week out, what are some of the examples in daily life, in practical terms, of what we mean by the essence of racism is power? What does it look like at home, at school, at work, in society? Just so we can really land it, it's not too conceptual and theoretical for us. What are some examples of what the essence of racism is power actually means to us? I know some of you are typing away, so I'll give you a minute to type your answers, and others might be actually thinking about it. Right? There are those who have and those who don't have privilege, right? There's dominance, right? That's what it can look like. It's what it can feel like. Othering, subjugating, right? What about some very specific examples of what it can look like in daily life, in political spaces? Superiority, invisible structures, thank you. Concentration and unequal distribution of power, very good. In education and other settings. In laws, very good. Okay, so we're getting to it more and more so. We understand how power is actually at the core of what racism has always been about. It's in housing, it's in education, it's in health. It's about laws and policies that reinforce discrepancies. It's about financial control. Thank you. All right, good, very good. And bullying, exactly, right down to the very basic level of prejudice. It's about bullying and othering in that situation as well, whether it's in the schoolyard or in the political space, even at its most base level, that power still exists, right? And in unconscious bias and privilege. Very good. Okay, great. So when we get power or unjust power dynamics, and then we get this construct of race, which we've unpacked in depth over the last weeks, what we end up with is what one of you mentioned a second ago, right? Discrimination, marginalization, exclusion, oppression. Those things don't come just out of the existence of race, and they don't come out of just the existence of power dynamics. It's the combination of those two things, right? So when there is imbalance in power and there is this thing called the race construct, then we end up with marginalization, discrimination, exclusion, and oppression. Now, historically, what has racial discrimination been based on? On what idea? For what reason did we have racial discrimination in the past? It was based on an idea. Let's see. What was the idea? I think a couple of you have already mentioned it tonight in the chat. If you think of the racial discrimination of the past, thank you, Miley, again, on the money tonight. It was based on a lie. Thank you, Torkan, as well. Very good. Yes. So historically, whether it was the idea of terra nullius, whether it was the transatlantic slave trade, whether it was segregation, whether it was boundary streets and redlining, racial discrimination historically has been based on cultural superiority. Okay. So that's really what racism has been about. It's been about the idea of cultural superiority, and it's been about the concentration of power in certain groups of society and the marginalization / exclusion, demonization of others, right? So if we want to use advanced 2022 kind of language to describe racism, and we really want to get to the pointy end, cultural superiority is really what it's about, right? We're evolving our language. We're no longer at the point like we were in the 90s or even in the early 2000s where racism was about prejudice, right? It's not just about telling someone to go back where they came from or, you know, we speak English here. Racism in the systemic sense and in the interpersonal sense is really built on cultural superiority. When we grasp that idea, it becomes a lot easier to understand how racism contributed to climate change, right? But we've got to get our language very clear right from the very beginning. So racism is basically a euphemism for cultural superiority, right? And then for those who missed our week 1 and week 2 session, the recordings are available on our website. We went through this wheel, right? For anyone who was unclear as to how could racism be more than the overt stuff, we went around this wheel. So we're not going to spend too much time on this wheel, but it is there. And I'm going to go through it very quickly so anyone who's watching the recording can slow it down and look at the words. Oftentimes we think it's just the prejudice stuff, the absolute extreme violence of child removals, lynchings, murders in custody, race, hate, violence. You know, we think of that as racism. And then if we get a little bit more subtle, if we get a little bit more nuanced, we think, oh yeah, you know, the refusal of service and, you know, racial profiling at airports or by the police, you know, that we speak English here, that kind of discourse, that's also racism. And, you know, most of us are willing to accept that as well. But it gets more subtle. It gets to like subtle bullying in the workplace or overt bullying in the workplace, rudeness and mistreatment. You know, I get that still on a weekly basis, racist jokes, etc. Then it gets even more subtle. Things like keep the statues here, or as long as they uphold Australian values, we can, you know, bring in the Afghan refugees, or sometimes it sounds like we have our own to look after. You know, why do we need more refugees? We've got our own poor people to look after. Mind you, people who usually say we have our own to look after aren't looking after their own either, interestingly enough. And then as we go around, it gets even more and more subtle, right? Bias in recruitment, misrepresentation in film and media, or simply the absence of people of color in film and media. These are more systemic outcomes. And then there's things like this. Aren't you glad you're here now? And how horrible it must have been to live in such and such place. And where are you really from? Or, reporters reporting on Ukraine invasion, saying how much more horrific that was for them. It becomes much less overt and more subtle as we go around and around. And eventually it gets down to a very pure form of cultural superiority, savior mentality, things like you speak so eloquently, where did you learn how to speak English? You must be adopted. The conversation on rewilding, that's subtle superiority. And we'll touch on that later on. Those of you who are familiar with the language around wilderness and rewilding, right down to things like, you don't have to wear hijab here because you're not in Afghanistan anymore. That's something teachers say to students sometimes. Or the very last one day, someone like you can have a job like mine, which is what I heard only a couple of years ago in a professional workplace setting. So this is a broad spectrum of what racism can exist like in society. It's the wheel of misfortune, and it's a lot more serious than the pun that's right in front of you. It's exhausting. It's everywhere. It's unrelenting. And it's not just the really, really overt stuff. So when we say racism led to climate change, we don't mean racist people who told us to F off back where we came from. We mean the systemic, structural, really power structures and superiority that go together that led to where we are today as a global civilization. Now, what does it look like in practice? I'm going to minimize this video so you can actually see the slides. Those of you watching the recording, I'll pull up the chat so I can keep an eye on what's going on here. These are some of the examples of what cultural superiority looks like in practice. All right. Now we can call this racism, we can call this white supremacy, or we can call it cultural superiority. It's basically the same thing. It's very hard to look at. Yeah, it is, Turkan. Yeah. Justification for slavery, right? The idea that they were less than human and they had no culture. There is more than enough documentation on Western perspectives of the continent of Africa from the 1400s onwards. The idea of terra nullius, no one lives here because they didn't recognize any civilization according to their perception of what it should look like. Stolen generation was about cultural superiority. The idea of saving the dying race or civilizing savages. These are all forms of cultural superiority. Now, even at that time, that language might not have been the most overt form of racism. We think that was the most overt, but at the time, there would have been even far more extreme versions of the racism. And those who were saying, let us re-educate these children, let us remove these children from their families, probably thought of themselves as do-gooders. They probably considered themselves as progressives, because on the other end of the spectrum, there would have been others who were practicing genocide, outright genocide, rather than slow, subtle genocide. The banning of indigenous cultures and languages, the whole idea of the Aboriginal Board of Protection, the White Australia policy, the dissection of the continent of Africa. The entire continent was cut up. Not a single square inch of that was left that wasn't, quote unquote, divvied up between the European nations. They sat at a conference in Berlin and each nation decided which part of the continent they want. The Dutch wanted this one, the Germans said that they want this one, the French said, well, if you're having that one, I want this one, and this one. The British said, well, yeah, you can have that, but I want this piece and this piece. And they cut it up like it was a cake in the 1800s, in the 1700s, as if no one's there. And those of you who are familiar with what's going on in Hawthorn Football Club and the racism that's been revealed there lately, that's a continuation of the same form of cultural superiority. Aboriginal and First Nations players told to cut off relations with their families, SIM cards snapped in half, new phone numbers given to them, players told to leave their partners, couples forced into aborting children. Like, this is not very dissimilar to the continuation of the cultural superiority of the past. So we need to get much more nuanced understandings of what racism, and understand that it's still to this day, what was going on at the Hawthorn Football Club is maybe one hair's breadth different from the whole idea of the stolen generation and why they did it. Yeah, that's what's been going on, Michelle. Some people still don't realize what's been going on. So yeah, that's going to have some cascading effects on society. Yeah, it does want to make us vomit. For those of you watching the recording, can't see the chat function. I sometimes read out the comments for you. Now, what does it look like in sentiment? This is really interesting. I want us to get a really deep understanding of what cultural superiority looks like. Because if we want to understand how racism led to climate change, then this is the deep stuff you need to understand. We saw what it looks like in practice. Now, what does it sound like? What is it in a sentiment form? The whole rhetoric of indigenous issues is cultural superiority. The idea that disparities in health or higher incarceration rates or crime rates or domestic violence are all somehow inherently indigenous issues, that is a reinforcing of cultural superiority. There is nothing inherently indigenous about those issues. Those are outcomes of systemic racism. And to refer to them as indigenous issues is a way of reasserting cultural superiority, externalizing the problems onto the communities and forcing them to bear the burden of systemic racism once again. So be aware of that. Anywhere you hear the language of indigenous issues, remember that is cultural superiority, putting the blame of these issues on communities again, rather than acknowledging, actually, that's a systemic racism issue. That language would help us solve them a lot faster, wouldn't it? We discussed that in week 7, I believe, in the health equity discussion, right? If we fix our language, then we can solve these problems much faster. But for as long as we refer to them as indigenous issues, we externalize the problem as a society onto indigenous communities and say, yeah, that's a problem they've got to solve. And that reinforces the idea of cultural superiority. Some of those other things you're seeing on there are things I've heard personally or have been relayed to me as stories. This is what cultural superiority sounds like in our friends, in our neighbors, in our family members. Such and such youth commit crimes because their families are dysfunctional. Or you must be so glad that you escaped such and such country. Let the refugees out of detention centers so they can, fill in the truck driver shortage. Just out of curiosity, does anyone remember who that person was? It was a very well-known person whose name is going to remain unnamed. But does anyone remember a famous tweet or a post that said, let the refugees out of detention so they can fix the truck driver shortage? That again is another prominent person in Australian society reinforcing cultural superiority. Right? So that's what it looked like in practice. You saw that one in policy, and this is what it looks like in sentiment. This is what it sounds like when people are speaking in cultural superiority language. Right. So these all sound terrible, but what has it got to do with climate change? I'm sure some of you are wondering that, or potentially this could be the question you get asked. When you're trying to explain this, at some point, someone's going to say, yeah, that all happened, and it's terrible that it happened, but it's got nothing to do with me, and I can't see the connection to climate change just yet. Right? So you're going to be prepared for these types of interjections or attempted derailments, because that's what's going to happen. Yeah, it's got nothing to do with climate though. Well, in order to understand how all of that stuff, the cultural superiority stuff that I just discussed, and racism led to climate change, we've got to get a clear understanding of what exactly is culture. And unfortunately, we don't educate ourselves well enough on what it actually is. Right? So let's start with what culture is not. All right? Culture is not just, and notice how I've underlined just, song and dance, food and traditions, right? What clothes you wear on what days of the week, when your religious holidays are, and your language and your favorite traditional dishes. That is not culture. Those are the aesthetics of culture. Those are the commodifiable bits and pieces of culture that some people like to cling on to. But culture is much deeper than that. And anyone who comes from a non-white background has a pretty clear understanding that their culture is not just that. But we tend to have a predisposition in Western societies to reduce cultures down to those elements of food, dance, cultural traditions, and package them into little bits and pieces that's more palatable for us. What's not so easy to come to terms with is the fact that actually culture is a worldview. A person's culture informs and influences how they see the world, how they interact with the world as an individual and as a group, as a collective. Culture is a collectively created thing, as an outcome of interactions between our environments and our family members and our community members, and it informs how we think. Now, rather than keeping it really vague and broad for you, I'll allow you to have a look at some of these questions and maybe answer some in the group chat if you like. Some of these questions you might have thought about on a regular basis. Others you might be like, why on earth are you asking me this question? At what age should children pay rent or leave the family home? That's different for different groups of people. For some people, you never leave the family home. In some parts of the world, still to this day, you just don't, right? In some cultures is when they're ready. Yes, in some parts of Australia, it's very common for them to begin paying rent or leave the family home when they turn 18 or finish high school. I had friends in high school who had to leave the family house or pay rent, right? That, interestingly enough, connects to the second question is, what do you do with elderly and infirm parents? Well, in many cultures, you don't ever leave the family home. You just become responsible for everyone else in the household, even after you're married in some parts of the world, right? These are all culturally informed. Our answers to these are not correct or incorrect. They are just different. And vast groups of the world all think differently about the answers to these questions. How do we perceive and respond to homelessness is culturally informed. What is the appropriate way to form a queue is culturally informed. If I was to create a poll, and I almost did, asking you, what's the appropriate distance at which you should stand behind someone in a queue? Some of you might have said 30 centimeters. Some of you would have said 50 centimeters. Some of you said with a meter. Some of you would have said 3 inches, and some would have said 6 meters. In some Northern European nations, the distance to stand is 10 to 15 meters if you're in a queue. In some parts of the world, you leave your jandals or your sandals in queue and then you sit down. Even how we form a queue is culturally informed, right? The British love a queue. Yes, they're very proud of how well they can queue, the British. How you feed expected or unexpected guests is culturally informed. In some parts of Northern Europe, you don't feed guests. A child can sleep over a friend's house and the family whose house he's sleeping over won't feed that child. That's culturally informed. So these are just some little bite-sized pieces of what some daily interactions in life have to do with our cultural perspective. One person's idea of a sustainable way to fish the ocean is culturally informed. Oh yeah, the fishing trawlers have to just have a quota and they've got to just like fish, in certain seasons and not doing during breeding season, whatever it is. But another culture's perspective is like, actually, no, you don't fish for millions of people around the planet. You fish for yourself. That's how you sustainably fish the ocean. That's culturally informed, right? And these shared cultural perspectives are what then begins to feed into and create our social structures and inform how our society is created. Yes, thank you, Michael. Human beings from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, from Tonga to Norway and Nicaragua will all have different answers to these, right? And yeah, some cultures that are geographically closer may have some similar answers. But the fact is, culture is much more than those aesthetic pieces that we like to think about. This is all culture. And the accumulation of this, the added bits and pieces of all of this, when it becomes shared by a vast group of people, eventually is what creates a society. It eventually what informs the broader, deeper questions of the purpose of life and, how economics flow and philosophy and the arts. All of that is an outcome of these basic shared understandings of how we interact with our world. So in short, culture informs/is our worldview. And those of us who have been colorized or otherized or racialized are fully aware of when our worldview interfaces with Western worldview, and when we are code switching, or when we are speaking from our cultural perspective, or when we're speaking from Western perspective. But those who live in Western colonial societies, because they've never had to have that interface point, think that their way of seeing the world is not culturally informed. That's just the objective, neutral, natural, standard way of being. And that's part of the problem. Everyone has a cultural perspective. Every white Australian has a culture and a cultural perspective. And all of the things that you think are too mundane or too ordinary or too objective to consider as part of your culture, that's exactly what your culture is. It's really important to remember that, because there is a tendency, and if you don't want to take my word for it, there are plenty of white men who say exactly the same thing. And this is one of them. What's this guy's name? Julian Borrell, very white name. lens through which your brain sees the world shapes your reality. Again, I can copy that link, share it in the chat. Sometimes it's easier to come from multiple sources than just from one. Culture drives behavior. Those shared behaviors then inform social laws and rules, and that then informs how our society functions, right? But many people around the planet have not been afforded that respect. Our cultures have been diminished, fetishized, commodified, dehumanized, reduced down to their basic core elements. And that's what our culture is. And then the Western perspective is taken as the objective, scientific, neutral perspective, and everyone else is culture, and we are neutral. That's part of the problem. Another video here for those of you who are interested. I'm going to copy this link also, throw it in the chat. You can save these for later. This was a nice video. It talks about how personality and behaviors are informed by culture. Talks about collectivist cultures and individualistic cultures. And it's not about demonizing or dehumanizing any one of them, really. It's just about understanding that just as much as we think that this type of behavior is normal and natural and that's just objective, that's actually culturally informed, and someone else's cultural perspective is what they think is objective also. So in short, our society is an outcome of our culture. In fact, all societies are outcomes of their cultures. So whether we're talking about Western colonial cultures here in Australia, our society is informed by that. And then every other person that arrives here in the last 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, comes also with with varied cultures. They come from different societies, and their societies function differently. And then, of course, that map that I showed you earlier, 500 nations on this continent, each with their own language. Each language is connected to a different culture. And though they share similarities and commonalities, they all are unique cultures. And part of decolonization is being able to pay respect to the fact that actually, just like Europe has got several hundred nations with several hundred languages, with several hundred very distinct and unique cultures, so too did this continent have hundreds of nations with hundreds of languages, with hundreds of distinct cultures, and each one of them was a slightly different, varied worldview, though they shared some similarities. That's part of understanding how to undo historic systemic racism. Some of you may have seen this cartoon. It's one of my faves. I've saved it and I've put it here for you. The panel on the left there, honestly, what's the point of doing anything? Humans are a virus on the planet. And then the panel on the right says, speak for yourself. This is, again, another clash of worldviews, right? Because, yeah, from someone's worldview, from someone's perspective, from someone's cultural engagement with our planet, yeah, they do behave like a virus, right? But that's only certain groups of people. Certain other cultures do not behave like a virus. They do not engage in extractive processes, and they actually have been engaged in custodial processes for tens of thousands of years. So again, when we speak, whenever we speak, we are speaking from a cultural perspective. So the character on the left there is speaking from their cultural perspective, which is informed by their society and how their society functions. On the next panel, it's a bit long. I'm not going to read it all out for you, but the artist is Spoiled Socks. So you can look it up. You can look this on Google. And yeah, it kind of outlines the difference between those different worldviews. So our society is an outcome of our culture. Our worldview informs our systems of governance, justice, economics, as well as our knowledge generation and transmission. Our philosophy, our art, our relationships with our community and the world around us are all outcomes of our culture. Whether it's Western colonialist culture in Australia, US, UK, whether it's the continent, the subcontinent of India, whether it's various First Nations cultures throughout the Americas, all of them had societies. All of them were civilized, all of them had culture, and all of them had their own systems of governance, justice, economics, unwritten laws that everybody knew. That's what it really is. Now, the simplification of non-white cultures. This is something that I could potentially talk about for hours and hours. This minimizing or diminishing non-white cultures or non-European cultures to beef vindaloo and chicken tandoori and Bhangra dance and Bollywood, or didgeridoos and boomerangs and some kitschy kind of like motifs that we like. that whole process of thinking that's what someone's culture is, and oh yes, let's have a cultural sharing day and you can bring food from your culture and you can dress up in whatever your culture, that whole process is infuriating. It's dehumanizing, it's belittling, it's commodifying and reducing cultures down to base elements. But what's most unfair about it is that it says to the world that that's what all your culture is, and then white Western societies can't get portrayed in the same way, right? They get to maintain the ideological dominance, and their cultural perspectives becomes the mainstay, it becomes the objective, natural, neutral, and everyone else's cultural perspective, their knowledge bases, how they create and generate knowledge and pass it on, how they see the world, how they see economics, their ideas on how society could or should function are all put aside. And instead, you've got some bowls of curry and some colorful dresses, and that's what someone else's culture becomes. So we've got to be really, really aware and wary of that type of commodification, dehumanization, and / fetishization of other people's cultures, because it's actually not accepting or acknowledging the full essence of what culture truly is. And that is an outcome of historic white supremacy and white superiority, not recognizing or perhaps not wanting to acknowledge the complexity of non-European cultures has got a 500-year history, right? So from the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, right, that infantilization, objectification, dehumanization, and diminishing of non-European cultures has got a very long history, which is why it's so infuriating in 2022 when it continues to happen. Because there's been this unconscious desire to not want to acknowledge the complexity of other people's cultures. So we've now got to have a conscious awareness around not doing that these days, because culture is worldview. National Geographic is a prime example of how this infantilization, fetishization, and dehumanization of people and reducing entire continents or nations down to traditional clothing and song and dance. They're a prime example of an organization that's done that, which is why they released an apology, a year or two ago about how racist their coverage was. Not just in the imagery that they continue to portray, but also the stories they continue to write, the fact that their writing staff generally never came from the parts of the world they're writing about, and their hyper-vigilant focus on certain elements of people's culture, right? And portraying people from wherever it was, Bangladesh, India, the Latin, South America, Central America, as objects, as things that can be studied and looked at and reduced down to almost less than human. And they've got a heritage of that, and they've apologized for that. But this is what we're talking about when we say there is a tendency to diminish and dehumanize people's cultures down to something that's palatable for them, something that's enjoyable, something they can put into an art gallery or a museum or a storybook, but not actually respecting them as full human beings, as full civilizations with complex systems of society and governance and economics and philosophy and spirituality. That is what white supremacy did to our planet. So colonization, when we talk about racism led to climate change, we mean the whole process of colonization, the whole underpinning white supremacy that justified colonization. And that did not just invade territories to steal resources, enact slavery, enforce their arbitrary class and gender constructs, and establish oppression and marginalization, which it did. It did all of that, colonization. But it also led to the enforced establishment of a specific cultural worldview as dominant, right? European Western worldview as dominant, authoritative, and supposedly civilized, while systematically demonizing, minimizing, and even eradicating entire cultures, i.e. worldviews, which they deemed as savage, barbaric, and uncivilized. We're now getting to the real point of it. If you ever had to explain how climate change is an outcome of systemic racism and colonization, this single slide will give you the succinct summary of it all. Everything we've done up to this point has been laying the foundations of it. But if you wanted to give someone a very quick answer, someone who had some basic foundational understanding, this would be the slide to explain it to them all. the enforced establishment of specific cultural views, right? When you acknowledge that Western perspectives, French, German, English, they had some similarities, the enforced establishment of that particular cultural worldview as dominant and authoritative and civilized, whilst systematically demonizing and minimizing other people's worldviews and cultures and calling them savage and barbaric, is what led us to be where we are today. This unsustainable, insatiable, consumerist, capitalist, voracious economy that we've got that constantly needs to be fed like a steam engine that's going to run out if you don't keep feeding it coal. That comes from a specific worldview. And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. A quote from Linda Tuhiwai Smith, an academic in the decolonizing space from Aotearoa. They write, to consider indigenous peoples as not fully human or not human at all justified various policies of either extermination or domestication. Some indigenous peoples were hunted and killed like vermin. Others were rounded up and put in reserves like creatures to be broken in, branded, and put to work. Whether it's in Aotearoa or the Americas or here in Australia, all over the world, this was a repeated pattern. Imperialism's dehumanizing imperatives were structured into the language, the economy, social relations, and cultural life of colonial societies. Really powerful words. If you haven't come across the book, Decolonizing Methodologies, I would highly recommend it. Full of incredible knowledge and something that I would recommend everyone reads. I will give you details of that book in a minute. What are some examples of this? What are some examples of this dehumanizing imperative structured into language, economy, and social relations? We've discussed some of them already. What are some of the ways in which these imperatives were structured into our society, in the language, in the economy, in the social relations? Just to refresh our memories. Because the next slide I've got has got a bunch of answers, but I'd love to hear some of them from you. Some cultural tattooed skin was sold for profit. Yeah. Oops, sorry, I just skipped a bunch of slides. There we go. Slavery. Thank you. Indentured labor. Yes, that's how it was structured into our economy and social relations. How else? Dehumanizing imperative structured into language. How about terra nullius? Hey, terra nullius. Yeah, you reckon that was structured into our language? It absolutely was structured into our language, right? That was a dehumanizing imperative that was structured into our language. Right? What else? Social relations and cultural life of colonial societies. Stolen artifacts and people's remains. Thank you. That's another way in which social relations and cultural life was structured with these dehumanizing imperatives, right? Because they didn't consider them as full human beings. So yeah, we can take our artifacts. In fact, does anyone know why the pyramids are in Egypt? Any ideas on why the pyramids are in Egypt? I'm sure you got lots of answers. They were too heavy to take to the British Museum. Exactly, right? Otherwise, you could go visit them in England. So that whole process of removing artifacts and even human remains is part of how it was embedded into society, right? Here are some other ways, right? Stolen land for agriculture, logging, and mining. That was embedded into the economy. And the idea of terra nullius, there is no one here, is how we embedded it into the language, right? The language of the noble savage, the language of wilderness, even the language of rewilding harks back to age-old racist discourse. I really do not like the language of rewilding, and it's because it's connected to the idea of wilderness, civilized, uncivilized. It's only a Western colonial perspective that calls the natural world wilderness in certain parts of the world. The whole idea that this was wilderness is what informed the idea of terra nullius. So when we talk about rewilding or protecting wild spaces, it's again reinforcing the same age-old language that some societies had civilizations and some societies lived in the wilderness. So you got to be very careful about that, because the whole process of rewilding arcs back to colonial kind of language. Child removal, cultural indoctrination and enslavement, denial of civil rights. These are all ways in which the imperial project dehumanized peoples and rip them of their society and their humanity. This is also referred to as white supremacy, the idea that only white peoples had culture and civilization that was worthy, and that their culture was so worthy, in fact, that others could be forcibly indoctrinated into it, their children removed, and indoctrinated into this higher, more superior culture. Now, today, it comes out as prejudice and systemic racism, right? So white supremacy can be expressed in various ways in today's day and age. When we think of white supremacy, we like to think of Ku Klux Klan and KKK and white sheets, but it's very subtle as well. And I've shown you that whole wheel of how subtle it can become. So this process of discovery, and discovery there is in quotation marks for a very specific reason, because even that whole discourse of discovery is colonial language. No one discovered this place. Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people have been here for almost 100,000 years, and James Cook did not certainly discover this place, just like Columbus did not discover the Americas. The guy was lost looking for India. So the whole language around the discourse of discovery is another way in which we reinforce colonial thinking and white superiority. But that so-called discovery, conquest, the exploitation and the redistribution of that wealth back to the motherland and the appropriation of anything else that was left is a part of the economic expansion of the colonial project. And it's not an event. It's not something that happened historically. It's an ongoing process. Now, I've got another poll question for you. Keep Tassie wild. Yeah, I know, like that, the language, thank you, Anthony. That language really arcs me because it reinforces the idea that First Nations peoples were living in wilderness and that there wasn't civilized. And, you know, it might be too subtle for some people to even recognize any problems with that. But yeah, I noticed something in that language that I really dislike. So I'm going to create another poll for you, if I can pull it up now, to see what is the extent of the colonization of the planet. How far did this actually reach? Let's see how well we know how far the extent of colonialism. I've launched a poll for you, and the question is, how many countries in the world have never been colonized by Europeans? Let's see what your thoughts are on this. The poll is now live. You can be answering it now. Have a guess. Most people won't know or have a clue or even thought about it. Let's see if we know. How many countries in the world have never been colonized by Europeans? Good, I'm impressed. 50% of you are hitting the right number. Let's see, some of you still thinking about it, more answers coming in. So 50% are not going to be surprised, the other 50% are. Good. Looks like entries have slowed down now. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, that's about it. Okay, cool. I'm going to end the poll. About a quarter of you didn't answer at all. So I'm assuming there's a large number of people who had no idea and didn't want to take a guess. So let's keep that in mind. Here's the results. Share the results with everyone. Less than 10 is the correct answer. In fact, less than 5 is the more correct answer. Mind-blowing. So I've got it up for you now. Not sure if you can see that and the poll. I'm hoping you can. Very few said over 100. About half of you said less than 20 or around 50, and about 50% of you said less than 10. The answer is actually 5, and even that 5 is arguable because Ethiopia technically gave up some of their lands when Italy colonized the countries around them. So yeah, Ethiopia barely makes it into one of the 5. The rest of the planet basically has been at some point in time colonized by Europeans. There's only a handful of countries that have not, Thailand being one of them, Japan being another. And again, this link, I'm going to copy the link for you. Anyone who'd like to read, it's a great article. If you don't have time to read it tonight or this week, just save it somewhere and just read up about the extent of European colonization. And if you'd like to learn more, then I really recommend you looking into the Conference of Berlin, where few of the European powers met together in Berlin and they decided how to dissect the entire continent of Africa, regardless of which cultures and ethnicities lived in which areas and how they were cutting these lands up. They didn't care. They just arbitrarily cut the continent up for their own purposes, as if nobody existed there. So here in Australia, we might think, oh yeah, Australia is colonized and New Zealand, and we might struggle to remember that, say, actually India was colonized up until the 1940s or 1938, and that in fact most of the world is colonized, either still is or at some point has been, and it's all really well documented. So that map really is quite sobering, and it really does bring home the point that, yeah, it is a certain part of the world that colonized the rest of the planet. And as much as conflict existed all throughout the planet, tribal wars, religious wars, all the rest of it, we get it. What we're talking about right now is the idea of white supremacy, the idea that white culture is better than other cultures. That's what has created the social economic construct that we now live within that has led to climate change. So as an outcome of that map that you just saw and the wealth that was generated through that, we now live in a global economy based on commodification, extraction, and exploitation, which is built on colonial wealth. So not only has that wealth disparity between nations been created by colonialism in the first place, by the removal of resources and the annexation of lands, but also the economic model that we are left with, that we have to function within, is also culturally informed and advocated and propagated by certain colonial powers. Capitalism. That whole idea, the consumerist lifestyle, the idea of extraction, commodification, exploitation, is a colonial construct. What do we mean by that? Because they're quite big words and we can throw them around sometimes and not really speak clearly. But what do we mean by commodification? Most of us know, but just for the sake of argument, it's really to commodify something, to render something a commodity, to make it, turn it into a product or a consumable with a specific monetary value attached to it, i.e. the commodification of water, the monetary value of trees, the value of oceanfront land. This is commodification. Anything can be commodified. Yoga has been now commodified, right? The fact that we need to even have a conversation around, is water a human right now, which is something that some of the corporates around the planet who sell bottled water are saying it's not. Water is not a human right. You've got to pay for it. That is a cultural perspective as an outcome of Western colonial culture. The idea that we even have to talk about, is water a basic human right? Right? That comes from a certain cultural perspective. Extraction, we don't just mean the resources sector, right? But that predisposition to remove, to take out for one's own purposes, for private ownership or for corporate wealth, or to remove and extract from other people's, to take away their culture, to commodify or appropriate their culture, right? For private gain or for the appropriation of knowledge for the environmental movement. That is also extractive. Exploitation, as in how the free market exploits underpaid workers in other parts of the world, or the exploitation of natural resources to exploit massive reserves of fish or trees, or even workers. Those of us who punch in and punch out day in, day out, week in, week out, understand that exploitation of natural resources and of human beings can happen in the Western world and in other parts of the world where labor isn't paid as much per hour, but the same dynamics are at play. These are outcomes of a specific cultural perspectives that are not inherently part of other people's cultures. And we need to continue saying that until people will finally listen. Because right now, the entire discourse around climate change, sustainability, regenerative practices, regenerative design, environmental protection, protection of biodiversity, all of these spaces are filled to the brim with Western, European, or colonialist voices, without acknowledging that actually there are other cultures who aren't trying to learn this stuff right now, right away. They've actually been practicing this stuff for tens of thousands of years, so much so that it's part of their DNA. So perhaps we should create some space for them at the table rather than stealing their knowledge and passing it off as our own, or passing it off as paying homage to someone else's culture. We don't need nobody to pay homage to First Nations culture. Make space for it and allow for that knowledge to exist in the same power dynamic as Western knowledge. That's what we are meaning when we say decolonization. It doesn't mean everybody has to go back to whichever motherland they came from. Decolonization means undoing the unjust power dynamics that have led to the marginalization, the exploitation, and the minimization of certain people's perspectives, cultures, and knowledges. As an outcome of that, now we have gross, massive economic wealth disparities across nations and within nations, right? So even those nations who were the champions of capitalism, even those nations that did as a country benefit from capitalism and built up national wealth, even they have gross disparities of economic injustice within their own nations. But then on a global scale, we've got nations that have got too much power over other ones. And this gross imbalance of power also doesn't allow for the proper process of consultation. You can't have a conversation with somebody about how to save the planet, how to redesign policy or economics, if they've got all the guns in the world, they've got all the money in the world, and you actually rely on them for aid, or for them to not invade your country, or for them to not steal your resources and not give you anything. So the whole power dynamic of our entire planet right now, and the amount of influence, wealth, military might certain nations have, is not just an outcome of colonialism, but is actually a continuation of it, a perpetuation of it. We cannot solve the complex social and economic and environmental problems we have right now if we do not address the power dynamic that's been established and allow for the proper, true process of consultation on a global scale between global leaders. That power dynamic that's been established over 500 years needs to be addressed. For lack of a better word, dismantled altogether. These unjust power dynamics do not allow for consultation. I'm going to keep saying that until we finally get it. It's not just about paying respect to First Nations people or to stealing their knowledge and then presenting it at the UN. It's not just about acknowledging that they are the traditional owners and that they safeguard 80% of the world's biodiversity. It's not just about that. It's about undoing the power dynamics, because the longer those unjust power dynamics maintain themselves and white cultural perspectives and white nations are able to dominate global discourse, then our chance at arriving at proper, appropriate solutions through a proper consultative process are delayed and denied. That's really at the core of it. The power that was established through white supremacy and cultural superiority needs to now be addressed in the ecological, environmental, economic, social justice space. This whole process, modern economic imperialism, is an outcome of colonialism, and it's been facilitated by expansion of European control throughout the colonies, and these resources have now, over the course of centuries, created these unjust power dynamics. Again, from Linda to Hiwaya Smith. As well, it's not just a moment in time, it is an ongoing process, right? So the appropriation or exploitation of Indigenous knowledge that I've mentioned is an ongoing process. The patenting of Indigenous superfoods, the use and appropriation of sweat lodges or massage techniques, all of that stuff continues on and on and on, which brings us to this point. One of the trickier points to unpack tonight that I'm sure some of you have got lots of thoughts on, and I'm going to open up the chat in case you do. The environmentalism space, the climate justice space, the climate action space, even right back to the 70s, longer, has been colonized as well. And it's not too far of a cry. It's not too far of a stretch of the imagination to understand it. But I really need people to understand this and be confident enough in this idea to be able to share it. The appropriation and extraction of quotes, knowledge, beliefs, and cultural perspectives by non-Indigenous authors and activists, which is often passed off as paying respect to First Nations people or including their voices, it's not true. Because it's not actually caring to address the power dynamics and oppression that marginalize that very knowledge in the first place. That's what we need to do to solve climate change. We don't need to steal Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous perspectives and read a couple of books here and there and paraphrase an Indigenous author's quote and platform ourselves and to a round of applause in order to solve climate change. We need to address the power dynamics that marginalized First Nations voices in the first place. Because without doing that bit, we are continuing the oppression, we are continuing the exploitation, we are continuing the extraction of resources for our own benefit again and again and again. So for all climate activists, for anyone who cares about climate change, anyone who cares about the future of our planet and the peace and security and stability of our planet, whether it's economic, ecological, or any other form, we need to address oppression and power dynamics that allow for oppression. Because only then can we actually truly sit around the table, whether it's at the United Nations or in an environmental group here in Australia, and actually have open conversations about what are some of the solutions we can come up with. Because until we address that power dynamic, then we're not really addressing the root cause of why we ended up in the place we are in right now, which is the over-dominance of a specific cultural perspective. Now, I need to reinforce here this point. This is extraction. When we talk about extraction, I don't just mean resources from the earth, right? Environmentalists, climate activists are renowned for doing this as well, extracting knowledge and information. I was asked to recently sit on an open panel to offer advice on race equity and the climate movement in Australia on a 3-hour Zoom meeting, and at no point was it indicated that I would be paid. And when I asked, I was simply removed from the meeting. I asked whether or not you're intending on paying me for my time, and I was just removed from the Zoom invite. That's extraction. So it happens still to this day. So it's those power dynamics that we need to address. Who can tell me what's racist about this image? We're getting close to the end of our session tonight. Doesn't seem to be anything inherently wrong with it, right, other than its representation or lack thereof. But what's the real issue with this image? Those of you who are working in the climate justice space, surely you will know the story. Right, so there is imbalance of power dynamic. Yep, that exists. But what are we talking about? Right, thank you, Vashti. This is the actual image. Ugandan activist was actually cropped out of the image. She was there. It's not that these are just the 4 girls who happen to be at the summit and they're the only climate activists who could get there. She was actually there. She made it there and was cropped out of the photograph. Like, how much that boils the blood, I cannot explain in words. This is the state of our climate movement, of our media, of cultural superiority, or whatever you want to call it. Now, some of you here will be well aware that First Nations people, Indigenous peoples around the planet comprise 6% of the global population, and yet they protect 80% of the biodiversity left on our planet. If that doesn't tell you that there is a gross disparity in cultural perspective, I don't know what else to tell you, really. If 80% of the planet's biodiversity is left under the custodianship of 6% of the planet's population, that is enough proof to tell us there is a significant disparity in how we see and interact with our natural world, and it is culturally informed. And it's not just about praising First Nations cultures for being such fantastic custodians for 80,000 years or 100,000 years or millennia. Right? It's not just about that. It's about acknowledging the other side of the coin, which is there is another cultural perspective which has been enforced on our planet. And if people from that cultural perspective who come from the spaces that actually led to the destruction of the planet, they need to now make space. Right? And to add to that, what percentage of the world's financial wealth does this 6% have? Thank you, Michelle. Exactly. A minute amount of the wealth. So it's about, yes, these people's worldviews, all First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples around the planet, their worldviews are different, but then also acknowledging the flip side of that. We know racial disparities and climate change. Anyone who works in the climate space knows that. Right? Time and time again, the story of climate change impacts people of color differently. Climate change impacts First Nations people, Indigenous people differently, comes up again and again and again, right? We love hearing about that. Everyone wants to talk about, oh, it's so unfair. It's unfair that people are being impacted by climate change differently. Now, I say that with that tone because of a very specific reason. Why would I say that these types of stories, how communities of color are hurt most by climate change, by Kellyanne Smith, or any number of other articles out there, why would I say use caution and to suggest to not overemphasize this whole language around disproportionate impacts? What do you think I'm highlighting here when I say don't lean too far into this conversation of what Kellyanne Smith here is talking about? Right? We know it's a fact, it's true, right? So Indigenous people do safeguard 80% of the world's planet, and they are most disproportionately impacted by climate change. What do you say? Vashti, you said because they are not acknowledging the real reasons. Thank you very much. And Rebecca says victimhood. Thank you very much. Well, the flip side of victimhood is what? Saviorism. That's what that kind of language allows. It facilitates, right? This whole overemphasis on the disproportionate. Every time we say climate change and racism, everyone wants to jump the gun and say, yes, 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 I know how it impacts people of color differently. And they just want to jump the gun and start ranting about how unfair and unjust that is. And it's true. But I'd rather talk about how the reason we have climate change in the first place is racism to begin with, rather than diverting the conversation and trying to satiate a sense of saviorism that says, oh, the poor people of color, they need my help and I can be a savior once again in this situation by advocating for the voice of the voiceless people. That kind of sentiment is what we need to be aware of and to not embody, because the reason why we ended up in this situation is because when specific people arrived on these shores and they saw this great continent, they referred to it as terra nullius. They denied the fact that peoples lived here with their own unique cultures and languages, and they continued to demonize and desecrate the land and the cultures of the people on this land. And it's that way of thinking, of clearing land, destroying river systems, cutting down trees, burning coal, digging up the earth for more resources. That is a cultural perspective that has come from a certain group of people. And I showed you where they came from, and I showed you how far that colonization reached the entire planet. From Dean Foley here, from Barra Yamal Consulting, a very, very, very brief summary, not to diminish entire world views and systems down to just one chart here, but these are some of the differences between Indigenous entrepreneurship and Western entrepreneurship. I'll let you have a look at that very briefly. We could speak on this for hours on end, and each one has its own benefits, its pros and cons. So it's not about now dehumanizing or demonizing another culture, because we've seen what that reaps, right? We've seen what the outcomes of that are. It's about understanding that a specific cultural view cannot save us from the situation we've got ourselves in. One type of one-eyed thinking got us here. And yeah, Western worldview, capitalist, colonialist, consumerist economy is a one-eyed worldview. It's only a specific part of the world that thinks like that. That won't help us get out. The same type of thinking that got us into the situation won't help us get out of the situation. So now let's look at the differences and the diversity of worldviews. Cooperation as opposed to competitiveness, right? Community-focused benefits, collectivism, right? Collectivist cultures versus individualistic cultures. Motives in Western entrepreneurship usually generate material wealth and status, financial independence and freedom. Independence and freedom are really Western things, much more in some parts of the world. And in other parts of the world, they're not so obsessed with independence and freedom. They're much more obsessed over community and collective outcomes and cohesion. And actually peace within the community is much more valued than individual independence or personal freedoms. Even how we discuss and describe personal freedoms is culturally informed. Right? Long-term focus as opposed to short-term focus. The success of the business, the expansion of operations, that's, Western entrepreneurship. positive impact within communities, satisfied with their contribution and support from the community. That's Indigenous entrepreneurship. And yeah, there's overlaps. These things are vague. There's no distinct barriers. You can't quantify a person's worldview, right? But yeah, these are some of the conversations we need to be having and understand that actually everyone's culture is a worldview, and every worldview needs to have a say at decision-making processes. And if those people who have had the most amount to say for the most amount of time are not able to create space, address unjust power dynamics, and allow for diverse perspectives to be shared, then we're not going to be able to solve the problems we need to solve. Professor Michael McDaniels, Pro-Chancellor from Jombana Institute at UTS, says interconnectedness of people, of country, of people, of winds, of water, of constellations, of people past and future, of the web of life, that to touch one element of the web of life is to affect all. I want to read that again, and I want you to think of the image that I show you time and time again when I talk about systems thinking. Do you remember that interconnected web of nodes and networks? When I say when you pull on one string, it affects everything else. Every time I've spoken about systems thinking, I've mentioned that. Now listen to this quote again. Interconnectedness of country, of people, of winds of water, of constellations, of people past and people future, the web of life, that to touch one element of the web of life is to affect all. Just that tells you how deeply embedded even systems thinking is in some cultures, where other cultures are still trying to learn about it, still trying to understand what systems thinking is. How do we apply systems thinking to social change? We're still learning. I'm still learning it because it doesn't come naturally. It's not in my blood. It's not in my DNA, but it is for some. This is why it's important. It's not just about saviorism. It's not just about saving people, or it's about saving ourselves as a global society. We finally need to have the humility to understand that, yep, all cultures have got benefits, pros and cons. And it's not about saying that all things that come from this particular culture are destructive and destroying the planet. It's about actually any ecosystem that's imbalanced, any ecosystem that doesn't have cohesion and each component can't contribute to the flow will become an unhealthy ecosystem. So the dehumanization that was part of colonization, the dehumanization that was part of white supremacy and slavery actually led to the dismissal of knowledge systems that indigenous peoples have developed for thousands of years and maintained active ecosystems through reciprocal relationships. Indigenous traditional knowledge has in turn served entire nations for generations by providing ecosystem and provisioning knowledge and services such as food, medicine, and mineral resources. This is a published paper, Indigenous Natural and First Law in Planetary Health. Again, if you'd like to take a screenshot of that, if you'd like to, I'll copy paste that into the chat as well. Anyone who'd like to look it up, that's what this quote comes from. I want to skip through to the very end. These are some screenshots of IPCC reports and summaries that say exactly what I've said. That's point B2 from the summary of the IPCC report. And I want to get down to the very end, the final kind of points of this session. Our current worldview and economic construct was enforced through racism, the way we function in our world. The current wealth and power imbalance in the world is also an outcome of that racism and colonialism. And not all peoples and cultures on the planet see, think, or respond to reality in the same way. All right, 3 key points very quickly. If you want to take a screenshot of that, take a screenshot. The next key points. The unjust power dynamics that we now have in our global society do not allow for proper consultation and consideration of perspectives. First Nations knowledge being appropriated by non-Indigenous people is also continued colonization, and I need you to keep an eye out for that. And the catastrophic outcome of climate change as a result of a specific economic and ecological model propagated by Western colonial cultures. Now, these complex problems we face as a society require us to include all voices and knowledge bases in fair and equal measure. This requires that the foundational principle of the oneness of humanity be established as common law and is applied as a frame of reference. Without that foundational principle of the oneness of humanity, then we are not going to be able to create the space we need to have the discourses and the conversations that we need to solve the problems we are facing right now. So this is not a process of demonizing specific cultures. It's an explanation of how we got to be where we are through the over-exertion and the enforcement of specific cultural perspectives. And now it's the job of all of us to be able to establish this foundational principle so that we can then tap into the true knowledge that all cultures on this planet hold. Western, Eastern, Northern, Southern, First Nations, Indigenous, Middle Eastern, Asian, doesn't matter. All cultures have got their own various perspectives. This is not just a white versus First Nations thing. It's the entire planet that we need to establish the oneness of. And sometimes it's easy to lose track of that. Advocating for peace, love, and unity without addressing those power dynamics is just continued oppression. And advocating for climate action, but not acknowledging the racist power that underpinned how we got there is also ignorance. And we need to move beyond that. Yes, we want peace, love, and unity. Yes, we want climate action. But in order to do that, we've got to address the power dynamics that got us to be where we are today. And to close with, I'm going to leave you with a quote that I may have shared with you earlier on in the series, which says, the well-being of humankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And that unity that we need, that we crave and we require to be able to solve our complex social, economic, and environmental problems requires justice. And that justice requires a redistribution of power, of influence, of wealth, and of voice. I hope that has been helpful. I hope it's been inspiring. I know 50% of you said you are confident explaining how climate change is an outcome of racism. And 50% of you said you weren't quite sure. So I'm hoping even those of you who had some understanding found some use in tonight's session. We have gone over by about 8 minutes. And I just want to thank you all for being here. This recording will be uploaded. So if you are working in these spaces of sustainability, regenerative design, climate action, and you think that people you know, organizations you work with might benefit from watching something like this, then send them to our website and they can catch the recording as of tomorrow afternoon. It'll be up there. If you haven't already told, I am wrapping it up tonight. So thank you for your thank yous. I'm going to give you a minute or two to send your messages in, and I'll stop the recording in a moment. So yeah, if you, we've got 3 weeks to go. Next week, believe it or not, I'm going to be bringing Ruby Hamad on to talk with us. So keep an eye out for Ruby Hamad next week. We're going to discuss some of the stuff in her book, White Tears, Brown Scars. If you'd like to know more about where you can start, what other books you can read, Talking Up to the White Woman is a great one from Eileen Morton Robinson. Can you believe it was printed 22 years ago? And some people still are hearing about it. Decolonizing Methodologies from Linda Tohiwao Smith from Aotearoa is the one I quoted a couple of times in tonight's session. So there's that one. If you wanted to write that down or take a screenshot. And the other couple of books, I've mentioned this one a number of times already. For those of you watching the recording, Another Day in the Colony by Chelsea Wattago, Professor Chelsea Wattago. Do tap into that one. 2 more. Africa is not a country. I think you know where that's going. So look into that. Africa is not a country. It's another great book. And finally, The Power of Unity. And that's about overcoming racial divisions and rebuilding America, but I guess the whole planet. So these are just some of my recommendations for those who are interested to read further. Thank you everyone for being here. Again, I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday night for week 10. Where's my book? My book's somewhere here, but that's not that important. Thank you everyone. Lots of love to you all. I'm going to stop the recording and I'll see you all